The fog hung thick in the air, so dense it felt like you could slice right through it. We rowed in silence, the sound of the oars barely a whisper, swallowed up by the mist. Beneath the boat, the sea was as black and lifeless as tar. I stood at the front, my gaze locked on the faint blur of land that was just beginning to emerge through the haze. We were close now, close enough to catch the scent of damp earth from their fields and the smoke that should have been rising from their chimneys. But something wasn't right. The air felt off. There was no noise except for the gentle slap of water against the boat and the sound of our own breathing. I knew what a village should sound like, even when it was quiet. There should have been dogs barking, kids splashing through the shallows. But there was nothing. Just an eerie silence. My thoughts wandered to the feast we were expecting, to the wealth waiting for us, left behind by men too weak to protect it. Yet, despite all that, the silence was starting to dig under my skin. The hull of our boat scraped against the shore, and we stepped out onto the beach without a word, slipping into the pale, ghostly light. The mist slowly peeled away, like a curtain being pulled back, revealing the village. It looked like something dragged from the depths of the sea. The houses were half sunk in mud, their doors hanging open. The people shuffled through the streets like cattle, heads down, eyes glued to the ground. Their skin was too pale, drained of color as though something had bled the life right out of them. "Look at them," whispered John from behind me, his breath hanging in the cold air. "They don't even notice we're here." No one said a word. There was something wrong in the way they moved, something unnatural in how they swayed, more like plants caught in a dead wind than people. We drew our swords, not for a fight, not for the glory of battle, but to still the growing unease that had settled, heavy, in our chests. John was the first to step forward, gripping his axe with purpose. He moved like a hunter closing in on easy prey, no fear, no hesitation. We followed behind him, weapons drawn, the mist curling around our feet as we advanced. It felt more like a routine than a real need. The people, if you could still call them that, barely seemed aware of us. They shuffled slowly, their movements heavy and sluggish, like their very bones had turned to lead. "Too easy," muttered Greg beside me, his voice low and full of disdain. I could hear the sneer in his tone, but something wasn't sitting right with me. There was a cold knot forming deep in my gut. This was all wrong. John was the first to strike, bringing his axe down hard, splitting open the skull of a man who barely even raised his head to see it coming. The crack of bone echoed through the fog, a hollow sound, but there was no scream, no pain. The body just collapsed into the dirt, silent, like it had never really been alive in the first place. I glanced around. The others had started moving too, swinging their swords and axes with practiced efficiency. Each blow took down another villager, no resistance, no fight. Just bodies dropping to the ground like sacks of grain. The air was filled with the dull thud of flesh and bone, but not one of us laughed or spoke. I struck a man down myself, a quick slice to the neck, and the way he crumpled didn't feel right. It wasn't the violent fall I'd seen so many times before. He didn't grab at his wound, didn't gasp for breath. He just slumped to the ground, eyes still open, face blank, like the life had already left him long before my blade touched him. "They're sick," Mark said from behind me, his voice tight with unease. He had just taken down a woman, her wide, glassy eyes staring up at him, mouth hanging open like she had forgotten how to close it. "None of this is right. None of it." John swung his axe again, splitting open the back of another skull with a grunt. "They're weak. We'll take what's ours and be on our way." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already taken everything from them long before we showed up. We moved through the village like shadows, our blades drawn but our hands growing heavy with doubt. The air wasn't thick with the smell of death, but with something worse. There was rot, sure, but it was something old, something that had been festering in the dark for far too long. It clung to the back of my throat, turning the familiar taste of salt and sea into something bitter, like ash. The bodies kept piling up, limp and lifeless in the mud. But there was no satisfaction in it. No spoils to claim, no challenge to ignite that familiar fire in our blood. Just the slow shuffle of those who were still standing, their eyes empty, their faces blank. They stumbled over the dead without a second thought, without even seeming to notice. It was like they couldn't feel the cold crawling through their bones, like they were too far gone to even realize they were dying. "Look at them," Greg muttered again, but this time the sneer was gone from his voice. He stood over a man he had just cut down, the body sprawled in the dirt at his feet. The man's skin looked waxy, stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were still wide open, staring blankly at the sky. His mouth hung open, like he'd been in the middle of saying something and just forgot how to finish. "There's something wrong with them," Mark said quietly. He stood nearby, wiping his blade clean, though there wasn't much blood to wipe. "This isn't just some sickness." John spat into the dirt. "They're dead. What difference does it make? We take what we came for." But there was nothing to take. The houses were empty, their hearths cold, their walls stripped of life. Food lay rotting in pots, untouched. We found no coin, no treasure, just signs of a people who had given up, who had abandoned their lives without ever leaving their homes. I glanced toward the shore, where the mist still clung thick, swallowing up the edges of the village, making everything feel like we were stuck in some half-world, caught between a dream and waking. Something was wrong here, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The silence was too deep, and the sickness was far too old. "We should go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's nothing here for us." John gave me a sharp look, but didn't say a word. He felt it too, the unsettling sense of something wrong, creeping up from the mud, hanging in the fog like a weight. He gave a single nod, and we both turned back toward the shore, our steps quicker, eager to leave. The bodies we left behind didn't move, didn't breathe, but the village seemed to pulse with a strange life that made my skin crawl. Out at sea, it felt like we were floating on an endless void, the water beneath the hull black and cold. The steady groaning of the wood as we rowed was the only sound. Even though we'd left that cursed place behind, none of us could shake the heaviness of the village or the silence that seemed to follow us. It clung to us, like the mist that still refused to clear, as if it was something we couldn't outrun. Mark was the first to fall ill. It didn't hit him all at once, it came on slow, like the sickness was lurking inside, waiting for the right moment. At first, it was just a cough, a roughness in his throat that he blamed on the cold, damp air. He tried to laugh it off between rowing, but the sound was forced, hollow. His skin had gone pale, but so had the rest of us. The sea could do that to a man. By nightfall, though, Mark had stopped laughing. He slumped against the side of the boat, his forehead damp with sweat, his breath shallow and labored. His chest rose and fell like a bellows that had been worked to its limit. "Just a fever," John muttered, though his eyes lingered on Mark a bit longer than his words suggested. "He'll pull through." But something in Mark's eyes was off. They were glassy, unfocused, like he was looking right past us, staring at something we couldn't see. He was still breathing, still with us, but it felt like part of him had stayed behind on that cursed shore, lost in the mist. "He needs rest," I said, though as the words left my mouth, I knew rest wouldn't be enough. Deep down, I could feel it, whatever had gotten hold of Mark, it wasn't something he could sleep off. We laid him down on the deck, his chest still rising and falling in uneven gasps, his hands clutching at the air like a man drowning, reaching for something that wasn't there. The others kept their distance, though no one said it aloud. But I could see it, they were afraid. None of them would look Mark in the eye. And neither could I. The wind died as the sun sank beneath the horizon, and the night closed in around us like a blanket of shadows. The only sound was Eric's breathing, faint but steady, like the slow, rhythmic pull of the tide. I stood watch with my back to the sea, silently praying for dawn to come. The sickness crept through the ship quietly, like a shadow stretching across the deck. At first, we hardly noticed. Eric still lay where we'd left him, his breathing now shallow and ragged, each breath sounding like a struggle he was slowly losing. We gave him water and talked about getting him back to shore, to the healers. But deep down, none of us really believed he'd make it. Whatever had gripped him wasn't something that could be cured with herbs or chance. By the second day, more of the crew began to cough. It started small, a slight tickle in the throat, nothing more than a moment of discomfort. But we all saw it, how it spread like ripples on still water. First it was Chris, leaning over the side of the ship, his face pale, his shoulders shaking. Then Greg, struggling to keep his grip on the oar, his breath coming in wet, labored gasps. "They're just weak," John muttered, though I caught the worry in his eyes. I saw how he glanced over at Eric, still lying motionless. "It's just the cold. Nothing more." But this wasn't like any cold we'd known. We'd sailed through much harsher winds and colder nights. We'd survived hunger, frostbite, and wounds that could kill a man. But this was different. It wasn't just the cold. Something had taken root inside them, deep in their blood, and no matter how hard they tried, it wouldn't let go. The rest of us started pulling back, huddling toward the center of the ship, keeping as far from the sick as we could. There were no orders, no commands, but the space around Eric grew wider. It was like a chasm, one none of us dared to cross. It felt like a retreat, though none of us would admit it. I watched Chris from the corner of my eye. His hands trembled as he gripped the oar, his breath shallow, just like Eric's had been. He was trying to row, but his strength was failing him. I saw it before he did, the way his hands loosened, the way his body slumped forward, lifeless, his face as pale as bone. "He's gone," someone whispered, though it wasn't true yet. But we all knew. There was no fighting it. One by one, the sickness took them, and with every cough, every strained breath, the rest of us withdrew further, our eyes locked on the horizon that never seemed to come any closer. I could feel it too, deep in my chest. Faint at first, but growing steadily, like a seed sprouting roots. The cold sweat, the weight in my limbs, it was all there. But I didn't speak of it. What good would it do to put a name to something we couldn't stop? John was always the last to fall. That's how we knew him, the one who held the line when everyone else faltered. He never spoke of fear, never showed it, and that was enough to keep the rest of us moving. Even as Eric's breath turned to a death rattle and Chris slipped into the icy grip of whatever sickness had claimed him, John stood firm. But by the third night, even he couldn't hide it anymore. I watched him lying there, propped against the mast, his chest rising and falling with slow, strained breaths. His skin had turned pale, a cold sweat shining on his brow in the dim light of the moon, which barely pierced through the thick mist. He stayed quiet, but the silence around him said it all. His hands trembled, just like Chris's had. His once muted cough was now a harsh, wet sound that tore from deep inside him. "He'll be fine," Greg said, though his words carried no weight. "He's John." But we all knew better, and so did he. By the time dawn broke, John hadn't moved. His axe, always within arm's reach, sat untouched beside him. He was still breathing, but it was shallow, barely a whisper. The color had drained completely from his face, and his skin was cold to the touch. Greg crouched beside him, but even he couldn't meet John's eyes anymore. There was nothing left of the man who had once led us, only the sickness, devouring him from within. "Let him rest," I said, though it sounded empty. Rest wouldn't save him. Nothing would. The sickness had already taken hold of him, just as it had the others. By midday, John's breathing finally stopped. We stood around him in silence, staring down at his body. There were no rites this time, no words of glory or honor. What could we say? John had been a warrior, but now he was just another corpse on a ship full of the dying. "We should burn him," Mark said, his voice weak and barely audible. Before, he trailed off. No one wanted to finish that sentence. But we had no fire, no flames to send him off properly. We didn't even move him. None of us could bring ourselves to. Instead, we left him where he was, leaning against the mast, eyes closed, his face as still as the dead sea that surrounded us. "He was the strongest," Greg whispered, his voice hollow now, all bravado gone. "If it took him, he didn't need to finish." John was gone, and we all knew it wouldn't be long before the rest of us followed.